Okay, let's begin. Okay, here we go. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Did I arrive in Guatemala?
Yes, I arrived in Guatemala.
Yes, I arrived in Guatemala. Where did I arrive?
Guatemala. I arrived in Guatemala.
Guatemala, right? I arrived in Guatemala. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Who arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead?
I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead.
Well, me, AJ, right? I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Did I arrive in Guatemala on November 3rd?
No, I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st.
No, I didn't arrive in Guatemala on November 3rd. I arrived in Guatemala on November 1st. What day did I arrive in Guatemala?
November 1st.
November 1st. I arrived in Guatemala on November 1st. Where did I arrive on November 1st?
Guatemala. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st.
Well, Guatemala, right? I arrived in Guatemala on November 1st. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. I was curious about this holiday, so I went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Was I angry about this holiday?
No, I'm not angry. I was angry. Sorry. No, I not was angry about this holiday.
No, I wasn't angry about this holiday. Was I sad about this holiday?
No, I'm not sad about this holiday. I was curious about this holiday.
No, I wasn't sad about this holiday. I was curious about this holiday. Who was curious about this holiday?
I was curious about this holiday.
Well, I was, AJ. I was curious about this holiday. What was I curious about?
Holiday. I was curious about this holiday.
The holiday, right? I was curious about the holiday. Which holiday was I curious about? Which holiday was I curious about?
I'm curious about this holiday.
The Day of the Dead. I was curious about the Day of the Dead.
I was curious about the Day of the Dead.
Was I curious about the Day of the Dead? Or was I curious about Christmas?
No, I'm curious about this holiday, the Day of the Dead.
Well, I was curious about the Day of the Dead, of course. I was curious about the Day of the Dead, so I went to the cemetery to see what was happening. go?
I go I go to cemetery to see what's happening. What's happening?
To the cemetery. I went to the cemetery. Did I go to the cemetery or did I go to the airport?
No, I go to cemetery. I went to cemetery.
Easy. I went to the cemetery. Who went to the cemetery?
I went to cemetery. I went to the cemetery.
Well, me, right? AJ. I went to the cemetery. Where did I go?
I go to cemetery.
To the cemetery, right. I went to the cemetery. When did I go to the cemetery? Oh, November 1st, the Day of the Dead, right? I went to the cemetery on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Why did I go to the cemetery?
I go to cemetery. What was happening? I went.
Well, to see what
To see.
was happening.
Yes.
I went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Who went to the cemetery to see what was happening?
I went to the cemetery to see what was happening.
Me, AJ, went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Where was the cemetery? In Guatemala. The cemetery was in Guatemala. What is the Day of the Dead?
The cemetery. Holiday. A holiday.
A holiday. The Day of the Dead is a holiday. When is the Day of the Dead? November 1st.
Okay, that's all about my sharing. Thank you so much for your attention. Goodbye.